Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. It's odd, isn't it, sometimes that you have readings, and this reading has been in the diary for many, many weeks now, and listening to Ali read it, my mind was certainly taken onto what we've seen in the news over the last day or so. But many of us, I'm sure, have enjoyed James Bond. Some of you might have read the books. Some of you certainly will have seen the films. The idea of 007 working for the British Secret Service. Glimpses into quite a glamorous lifestyle. The latest gadgets, technology used in spyware. The relationship with M, Bond, travelling the world. And often on his travels, Bond will meet someone. They will form a relationship with them. They will work with them. And it looks like those two or that group are together working for the same purpose. But then there's a twist. And that person is not actually a friend, but rather a foe, working against Bond than for him. Bond has been deceived, double-crossed by somebody pretending to be someone that they are not. That act of betrayal. We continue our voyage through the lesser-spotted, or some of the lesser-spotted aspects of the life of David. David of David and Goliath fame. David anointed by Samuel to be king of Israel, but not crowned for another 15 years or so. David, who was popular. You'll remember the song, Saul, who has killed 1,000, David, his tens of thousands. And that popularity prompted Saul, the king of Israel at the time, into this murderous, jealous rage against David that we picked up a few weeks ago in chapter 18, Saul hurling his spear against David. David, who is on the run. David, who's trying to scratch a living in the wilderness of the Middle East. David, who arrives at a place called Nob, only to deceive the priest in chapter 21, to say that to get food for the journey and sword for the fight. I'm here on an errand from Saul, you might remember in chapter 21. David, who has been observant to God's direction, not killing when he had the chance, even though Saul was chasing him down. You remember a couple of weeks ago, Joe talking about that moment in the cave where David could have killed Saul, but chose not to. David struggling to remember God's call on his life. David, who's probably very tired. He spent much time running, hiding, fearing for his life. And I'm sure there are parallels with our life and our existence. We may have similar emotions and occasions where we are being chased. Now, it's unlikely that we're going to be literally chased in the wilderness in the Middle East. But maybe we're chased in a work or family context. We struggle to remember and cling on to what God is inviting us to do. We need people to remind us about what God has done before. There will be times when we are just about surviving. And we reach the passage today and find David in a similar place. And verse 1, Jacob, if you're happy to put verse 1 up on the screen for me, please. Verse 1 starts with these words, but David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hands of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. Everything is against me, David is thinking. One day I'm going to be destroyed. My back is against the wall. David perhaps has a slight faltering in his faith. I think I probably would do too if this person was pursuing me with the intent that he was. So David thought to himself, this is what I need to do. I'm going to be killed unless I escape. So how about I go from the land of Israel, which is the land which is controlled by Saul, and I go to the land of the Philistines. Now you'll remember the Philistines are the enemy of the Israelites, and you'll remember also, even if you know nothing about David and this narrative, you will remember that David killed Goliath, and Goliath was the champion of the Philistines. So David was going to go from his home place in Israel to the land of the Philistines, whom he had defeated just some time earlier. That's a big and courageous move, and perhaps presents a slight insight into how backed into the corner David felt he was. David was, in essence, going to live with the bad guys. What might we do in these circumstances? I suspect running is probably one of the routes we may take. But look, David thought to himself. David thought to himself, the best thing I can do. This is the David who had surrounded himself with friends, and you'll remember his friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son. This is David who had spent time in the wilderness with God on his own. He drafted beautiful poetry, "The Lord is my shepherd." This is the David who finds himself in fear, lost in his own thoughts, in his own world, seeking to determine the best route for him, the best route for himself, independent of listening to any friends or independent of listening to God. David thought to himself. What do we do in those times of difficulty? Do we plan? Do we work out what's the best thing to do in our own minds, in our own thinking? Do we discuss with friends or family? Do we search God and try and seek out what God is doing? Or do we think to ourselves, saying, this is what I'm going to do? So verse 2, David and the 600 men with him left and went to Achish, son of Maach, king of Gath. In other words, he does what he needs to do to survive. He leaves Israel and goes to the land of the Philistines. He goes to an area called Gath, and he goes to an area called Gath, which has a king called Achish. We do what we need to do to survive through gritted teeth, that false smile, and maybe some guilt. I'm doing this because I have to. Now, for those of you that have been following this series with rapture over the last month or so, you might recall that we've been to Achish before. I know you all sit there going, oh, you've been to Achish before. You'll remember a few weeks ago that David went to Nob, and he went to the priest, and the priest recognizes who David is, and David was very famous, very popular. And the priest says, so what are you doing here? And David says, I'm on a mission from the king. And he says, okay, but you haven't brought any weapons or anything. I left in a rush. And if you remember back in chapter 21, that was just a lie, really. David was on the run. He wasn't on a mission from Saul, and he deceived the priest at the time. He then leaves that priest at Nob and then goes in to Achish at the end of chapter 21. And you might remember that he feigns insanity. He feigns that he's mad in the presence of the king, Anguish. And so the king sent him away. I don't want this person anywhere near me. And then immediately, the chapter 22 opens with these words, and this isn't on the screen, but David left Gath. He escaped to the cave of Adullam, where his brothers and his father's household heard about him. They went down to him there. All who were in distress, or in debt, or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. So David, who is an outlaw, David attracts similar people to himself. Those who are in distress, those who are in debt, those who are discontented gather around him. People attract people. Like attract like. The fellow misfits gathered around David, and a community was formed. A church is created. And this church is still in existence many months later, as we gather here at chapter 27. So David and the 600 men now. The church has grown. There's been a good evangelistic crusade, or they've wheeled out Billy Graham or whatever it is these days, and the church has grown. David and his 600 men left and went over to Anguish, son of Moek, king of Gath. This group settle in Gath. This group settle in this land which is Philistine, and so an enemy to them. But because of that, Saul is unable to hunt them down. It's too risky to go into that foreign land. So they gather and they speak with King Anguish. And David says, please, can you give us a place to be called home at the bottom of the screen? Let a place be assigned to me in one of the country homes. And then we get to verse 6. So on that day, Anguish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in the Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. David moved into enemy territory. He took his following of people that were in distress, who were in debt, who were in discomfort, who were in discontent, and he pleaded with the king for a place to call home. And he was given this place called Ziklag and lived there for 16 months until the death of Saul. He was living in a foreign land, making do, doing what he needed to do in order to survive. And verse 7 talks about what David did to survive. And we may have been in those places where we've had to run 3 jobs, work in essence night shifts, bar work, doing whatever was needed to pay the bills. What did David do? David ostensibly hired himself out as local security. Or perhaps, to put another way, he became a mercenary. He defeated, in verse 7, and destroyed, leaving no man or woman alive. And he took all the animals and property. Speed that he raided. If you put the next one up, please, Jacob. We read that he raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Now, we all like the ites, don't we? We all like the thishites and that. We're all experts at them. So we're just going to have a quick practice. So we're just going to have a quick practice so that next time you have to do a reading, you're expert at them. So the Gershurites. Very good. The Gerzites and the Amalekites. And we're going to go again. The Gershites, the Gerzites, and the Amalekites. Expert. You've got a whole list of people here, Joe, who can do readings from the Old Testament in the near future. And so what the passage says is that David went to the Gershurites, the Gerzites, and the Amalekites, destroyed the people there. I'll just leave that hanging, forgive me, and then returned to King Achish. But there's a little bit of a difficulty again. We've already had David's deceit or deception, which appeared slightly earlier on in his narrative. Because when he returns back to Gath, when he gets back to Achish, he speaks to the king. And the king, understandably so, says, so what have you been up to then? What have you been doing? And David would say in verse 10, please, Jacob. David would say, I've gone out and I've really helped you in battle. I've gone out and I've beaten, and I've gone out in verse 10. It said David would say against Negev of Judah, against Negev of Jeremiah, against Negev of the Kenites. Now let's go back to those other three places, okay? The Gershurites, the Gerzites, and the Amalekites, okay? That's what David did. What did David say that he did to the king? Well, he says, I've gone out against Negev of Judah, Negev of Jeremiah, against Negev of the Kenites. They bear no resemblance to each other. No resemblance to each other at all. In fact, the reason they bear no resemblance to each other is because they're completely different places. What David did and what David said he did were two different things entirely. The reason being, the places David said that he raided, the places David said that he went into battle for the Philistine king, were places that belonged to Judah, that belonged to Israel. The land that David actually did raid and plunder and destroy belonged to the Philistines. David was saying to King Achish, look at me, look at how successful I am being for you in defeating your enemies. This is how much you can trust me. The reality is that David would be going out to the populations of the Philistines and destroying them. The Gershurites, the Gerzites, the Amalekites belonged to Philistine territory. David was returning to Achish and saying, look how successful I've been for you. But in reality, David was destroying Achish's own territory, destroying everyone so that no one could grasp him up. What do we have here? Double crossing? Betrayal? Espionage? Maybe a parallel with Bond, James Bond? I suspect that there's no one here who's not spent some time in a place like Gath and under the patronage or control of somebody like Achish, because there's no other choice. We probably feel terrible about it, but also at the same time not knowing the first thing to do about how to get out of that situation. It might be having a job with a company whose approach or morals or ways of business is contrary to what you perceive the kingdom of God to be about. It might be having a close relationship with someone who is very antagonistic to the God that you worship. It might be the frustration of being tangled within an economic and societal system that exploits the poor and ignores the oppressed, living in these places that we really don't want to live in, but we have no other choice. And in those places, we do what we need to do to survive. We cling on to the faintest image and recollection of God that we have, perhaps even doubting to ourselves that God was ever interested in us, and mirroring the image and the words of the serpent from the Garden of Eden. Did God really say that? The narrative here does not present David's way as being the right way or the positive way of being. It doesn't say that God commended David for his actions or was supportive of them, and that's important, I think, particularly in the context of the last couple of days. This passage is a narrative event and simply outlines what David did. But I would suggest, as we come into land, that there are a couple of key points to cling on to. The first I would suggest is around the importance of community. Our walk with Christ is not and should not be a singular walk. Although David started with his thoughts to himself, and a route that he chose to take, this is what I'm going to do, he eventually took this route in community, with the 600 people gathered around him, landing eventually at Ziklag. Every story that we are involved in involves other people, many of who are in debt, distress, or discontentment. It's complicated, but that's what life is like. We are a thread of a plot, but that thread does not exist on its own and weaves itself many times into the stories of other people. We get disillusioned at times. We think we can do better ourselves. We think our own thoughts. We decide our own courses of action. But if we're honest, we can't do it alone. We can't live in those wilderness places where our back is against the wall in isolation. We need others. We need community. We need a fellow band of people who are in debt, distress, or discontentment. We need a place like Ziklag. And secondly, it's in Ziklag that we discover and we remember the other core truth of this passage. That however distant we might feel from God, however whatever is going on around us just seems completely opposed to what God is about, perhaps even however much our own actions don't point to God, God continues to work his purposes out, most profoundly at the times when we don't expect them. We might have this perception of what it means to be spiritual and have and to be in line with what God has planned for us. We may have this utopian ideal in our head, a pre-fall Garden of Eden. But the reality is that we're often serving a foreign king and sometimes having to double cross in order just to survive and to continue putting one foot in front of the other. Gathering with a ragamuffin group of people who come from all walks of life with different experiences, but all with that core belief that there was something bigger and better. And God shaped whole, if only we can find it. In those places where we're clinging on to survive, where our backs are against the wall and we just having to manage best we can to put one foot in front of the other, God continues to be involved. God continues to be at work, and God continues to gently guide us to be the people he would have us be. May we pray.